What if the war is not ending at all? What if Washington is only changing the headline before the next explosion begins? If you want sharp, serious analysis that cuts through noise and gets to the real power game underneath the news, subscribe to the channel and support our work. That support helps us keep producing the kind of reporting and commentary that does not just follow events, but explains what they mean before the rest of the world catches up. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics, and today, we break down what's shaping our world. The most dangerous thing in politics is not always the missile. Sometimes it is the sentence. Sometimes it is the shift in tone that tells you the structure of power is moving before the map has caught up. That is exactly what we are seeing now. Donald Trump is signaling that the United States may be ready to leave Iran without a deal. Israel, meanwhile, is signaling something very different. It is not talking about closure. It is not talking about restraint. It is talking about crushing what it calls the terror regime. That means the battlefield may be producing one reality, while Washington and Jerusalem are already imagining two different endings. And that is where the real story begins. For the American public, Trump's message is easy to understand and politically potent. It says America hit hard, reasserted strength, damaged Iran's capacity, and now wants out before the mission becomes another bottomless war. After 2 decades of strategic exhaustion, that message lands. It speaks to a country that is tired of blood, tired of drift, and tired of paying for conflicts that never seem to end cleanly. Trump is tapping into something real, the collapse of public patience for endless foreign burdens. But there is a brutal difference between leaving a war and ending one. What Trump appears to be offering is not peace. It is an exit option. It is a narrower formula of power: punish, disrupt, weaken, declare success, and step back. That may be politically smart. It may even be militarily efficient in the short term. But it leaves the deepest question unanswered: what happens to the system after America reduces its role? Because wars do not live only on battlefields. They live in damaged incentives, wounded states, revenge calculations, proxy networks, energy choke points, and financial fear. That is why this moment matters so much. Israel does not seem to be operating on the same timetable. For Israel, Iran is not a distant problem to be managed and then left behind. It is a permanent security structure made up of missiles, proxies, regional reach, and long-term strategic threat. So if Washington is thinking about disengagement while Israel is thinking about deeper destruction, then the alliance may still share an enemy while no longer sharing the same endgame. And when allies stop sharing the same endgame, instability grows fast. This is not just about Iran. It is about the future of American power. It is about whether Washington still believes it must shape order, or whether it now believes it can strike hard and walk away. It is about whether financial pressure, voter fatigue, and strategic overload are now pushing the United States toward a more transactional doctrine of force. Most of all, it is about whether what looks like de-escalation is actually just the beginning of a far more dangerous second phase. Trump's real message: mission accomplished, terms optional. Donald Trump's real message is not simply that the United States wants flexibility. His real message is that Washington wants the authority to declare victory without being trapped by the burden of formal terms. That is the heart of it. When Trump says Iran does not need to make a deal for the United States to leave, he is not just improvising a line for television. He is redefining what success looks like. In his framework, success is no longer tied to a negotiated settlement, a written diplomatic structure, or even a stable political end state. Success becomes something much narrower and much more force-based. If Iran has been hit hard enough, weakened enough, and pushed back far enough, then America can say the objective has been met and move on. That is a very powerful political formula because it removes dependence on the other side. Trump does not want the end of this conflict to look like it required Tehran's consent. He does not want the image of a superpower waiting at the table for an adversary to cooperate. He wants the image of control. America acts. America decides. America exits because America chooses to. That is not just rhetoric. That is a theory of power, and it is deeply tied to Trump's instinctive view of leadership. Strength must appear self-sufficient, and retreat must be framed as command, never compromise. There is also a domestic calculation here that cannot be ignored. Trump understands that the American public has little patience left for long diplomatic processes attached to military campaigns. Voters hear words like negotiations, frameworks, and monitored compliance, and many of them hear delay, weakness, and cost. Trump is speaking to that frustration. He is offering a cleaner emotional transaction. He is telling Americans that the country does not need to stay stuck in the machinery of endless diplomacy after showing overwhelming force. That message is simple, marketable, and politically effective. But strategic reality is rarely that simple. If Iran's capabilities are delayed rather than permanently erased, then the United States may be presenting temporary disruption as lasting resolution. That is the central weakness in this doctrine. It is built to project decisiveness in the present, but it may not answer the long-term question of what comes next. A state under pressure does not always break. Sometimes it absorbs damage, learns, adapts, decentralizes, and returns later in a harder form. That is why force without structure often produces unstable outcomes. It can suppress risk for a period of time without truly removing it. This matters because markets, security planners, and adversaries all look beyond the headline. They ask whether this is a real settlement or simply a pause wrapped in strong language. They ask whether the military result has been converted into political durability, or whether the White House is trying to cash in a perception of success before the deeper bill comes due. And in many conflicts, that bill does come due. It comes through renewed escalation, indirect retaliation, higher risk premiums, and the slow return of the same threat under a different label. So when Trump says a deal is optional, what he is really saying is something much bigger. For this White House, legitimacy comes from demonstrated force, not from negotiated closure. That may sound strong. It may even feel refreshing to a tired nation. But if the structure underneath remains unresolved, then the language of mission accomplished may end up being less a conclusion than an attempt to seize the narrative before history delivers its own verdict. Israel's position, not withdrawal, but decisive compression of Iran's power. Israel's position is built on a colder logic than the one now coming out of Washington. For Donald Trump, the question appears to be whether the United States has imposed enough damage to justify stepping back. For Benjamin Netanyahu, that is not the real threshold. The real threshold is whether Iran's power has been compressed so deeply that it cannot reorganize, rearm, and return as the same strategic threat under a slightly altered form. That is a fundamentally different standard, and it explains why Israel's language is harder, less flexible, and far more unforgiving. When Israel says it wants to crush the terror regime, this is not just a slogan for domestic morale. It reflects a security doctrine shaped by geography, memory, and repetition. Israel does not look at Iran as a distant rival that can be managed through occasional pressure. It looks at Iran as the center of a long-term threat system. That system includes missile production, intelligence networks, proxy forces, ideological mobilization, and the persistent ambition to surround Israel with pressure points that can be activated in moments of weakness. From that perspective, a temporary pause is not safety. A damaged structure that still has the capacity to regenerate is not a solved problem. It is a postponed one. That is why Israel's war aim appears broader than Washington's current signaling. The objective is not simply to punish. It is to compress. That means reducing Iran's room to maneuver at every level: military, political, organizational, and psychological. It means degrading command chains, striking production capability, disrupting the links between Tehran and its regional network, and forcing a new deterrence equation that lasts longer than a news cycle. Israel is not only trying to weaken capacity. It is trying to alter behavior by raising the future cost of rebuilding that capacity. This is where power structure matters. The United States can think in terms of burden sharing, exit timing, and political bandwidth because it has strategic depth. Israel does not have that luxury. A superpower can treat exposure as optional. A frontline state cannot. That difference changes everything. It changes how risk is measured. It changes how patience is defined. It changes how victory itself is understood. What may look to Washington like a reasonable moment for disengagement may look to Jerusalem like the most dangerous point to stop. There is also a deeper historical instinct at work. States that live under recurring threat do not trust partial neutralization. They have seen what happens when the outside world calls a conflict contained while the threat network quietly adapts. They know that underground rebuilding, proxy substitution, and strategic patience can restore danger faster than diplomatic language can acknowledge it. That is why Israel's position carries such urgency. It is not driven only by anger. It is driven by the fear of leaving the job half-finished and paying for that hesitation later in blood. This creates a serious tension inside the alliance. Shared enemies do not automatically produce shared endgames. The United States may be asking how to avoid another drawn-out war. Israel is asking how to prevent another future war that may be even harder to contain. Both calculations are rational within their own systems. But they are not the same calculation. And when partners stop measuring danger by the same clock, strategy begins to fracture beneath the surface, even while public solidarity remains in place. Iran is wounded, not settled. Iran is wounded, but that does not mean Iran is settled. And that may be the most dangerous misunderstanding in this entire crisis. Too many people look at visible damage and assume political submission must follow. That is not how states behave under pressure, especially not regimes built on ideology, survival, and the ability to turn pain into a narrative of resistance. A country can lose facilities, lose commanders, lose production capacity, and still refuse to accept the strategic meaning its enemies want to impose on it. That is the core point here. Damage is measurable. Submission is not. Iran may have taken serious blows to its military infrastructure and strategic confidence. It may be under intense pressure. It may even be signaling that it wants the war to stop. But wanting the violence to stop is not the same as accepting defeat on someone else's terms. For Tehran, the political risk of appearing broken may be almost as threatening as the military damage itself. A regime that defines its legitimacy through endurance cannot easily accept humiliation in full public view. The more pressure it absorbs, the more it may feel compelled to prove that it still has agency, still has reach, and still has the ability to shape the next move. This is where many outside observers make a serious mistake. They assume that if Donald Trump decides the United States has achieved enough, the conflict can simply begin winding down on Washington's timetable. But Iran is not a passive object in that equation. It has its own logic, its own threshold, and its own strategic culture. A wounded state often becomes more unpredictable, not less. It may avoid direct escalation if the costs are too high, but that does not mean it accepts the underlying balance of power as settled. More often, it looks for other lanes of response: indirect pressure, deniable retaliation, regional activation, economic disruption, and psychological signaling designed to show that pain can still flow both ways. That is why the proxy dimension matters so much. Even if Iran's central capacity has been weakened, the broader ecosystem around it can still carry strategic force. Networks do not need to win conventional wars to keep instability alive. They only need to preserve uncertainty, raise cost, and deny their opponents the comfort of closure. This is how a damaged power stays relevant. It shifts from direct confrontation to distributed pressure. It trades symmetry for endurance. It turns the battlefield outward. There is also a deeper historical pattern here. Major powers often misread wounded adversaries because they focus too heavily on the material side of war. They count destroyed sites, interrupted programs, degraded supply lines, and conclude that the strategic problem is shrinking. But strategy is never just material. It is also psychological, institutional, and symbolic. A regime can lose assets while preserving intent. It can lose territory while preserving narrative. It can lose a round and still prepare for the next contest. That is especially true when national pride, regime survival, and regional influence are all tied together. So the correct reading is not that Iran is finished. The correct reading is that Iran is under strain and therefore entering a more dangerous phase of calculation. A cornered power does not always collapse. Sometimes it adapts. Sometimes it hardens. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes the very effort to prove that it has not been broken becomes the engine of the next escalation. That is why this moment requires discipline from analysts and honesty from leaders. The battlefield may show weakness. The political system underneath still shows will. And in international conflict, will has a way of surviving long after outsiders think the outcome is already clear. The real front line runs through oil, shipping, and the American wallet. The real front line in this crisis is not only in Iran, not only in Israel, and not only in the language of military briefings. The real front line runs through oil routes, cargo lanes, insurance markets, refinery expectations, and finally into the everyday financial life of the American household. That is the part many leaders avoid saying too plainly. They talk about deterrence, escalation, and national security. But for millions of people in the United States, the first place this war becomes real is not on a map. It is on a gas station sign, a grocery receipt, an airline ticket, a retirement statement, and a monthly budget that suddenly feels tighter for reasons most families did not choose and cannot control. This is how modern geopolitical shock works. It travels fast because the global economy is built on confidence, flow, and timing. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow waterway in the Gulf. It is one of the central valves of the energy system. The Red Sea is not just a shipping corridor. It is part of the commercial bloodstream connecting production, transport, and price formation across continents. When those arteries are threatened, even before they are fully blocked, markets begin repricing risk. And that repricing becomes a tax on the real economy. This is why energy matters so much more than headline politics. Oil is not simply another traded commodity. It is a master input. When oil risk rises, the effect spreads outward into transportation, agriculture, manufacturing, plastics, chemicals, aviation, retail distribution, and consumer confidence. Every serious economist understands this principle. Energy shocks do not stay isolated. They multiply. They move through the system in layers. First comes the fear premium. Then comes the logistics premium. Then comes the cost pass-through. And finally comes the political backlash when households realize their paychecks are being squeezed by events far beyond their control. That chain reaction is what makes this conflict so dangerous for the United States, even if Donald Trump wants to reduce America's direct military role. The battlefield and the balance sheet are connected. A tanker threat in one region can become a price spike in another. Insurance costs rise when maritime risk rises. Freight rates respond when routes become less secure or more expensive. Airlines feel it in jet fuel. Farmers feel it in fertilizer and transport. Retailers feel it in distribution costs. Investors feel it in volatility. Families feel it in everything. And once the American consumer feels it, the political meaning of the war changes immediately. Because in the end, voters do not experience foreign policy as an abstract theory of force. They experience it as cost. They experience it as instability. They experience it as one more reminder that the global system remains fragile and that Washington's decisions carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. This is especially important in a country still psychologically marked by inflation shocks. Even a moderate increase in fuel or food prices can trigger an outsized public reaction, because Americans are not just responding to today's numbers. They are responding to a deeper fear that stability itself is slipping out of reach. There is also a financial power story here that deserves more attention. Markets do not only react to destruction. They react to uncertainty about duration, spillover, and stake capacity. Traders can handle bad news more easily than they can handle unclear news. A known disruption can be priced. A drifting conflict with unclear limits becomes much harder to absorb. That is when capital becomes defensive, investment becomes cautious, and businesses delay decisions. In other words, the cost of war is not only the visible damage. It is also the invisible hesitation it creates across the entire economic system. So when people ask whether this conflict matters to ordinary Americans, the answer is immediate and unavoidable: yes, because the war economy is already larger than the war zone. That is the hard truth. The missile trail leads to the market screen. The market screen leads to the household budget. And the household budget is where political patience in the United States begins to break. What this crisis reveals about American power. What this crisis reveals about American power is not simply a military question. It is a question of identity, endurance, and price. It forces the United States to confront something deeper than any one battlefield decision. What kind of superpower does America still want to be when the costs of leadership are rising, the patience of the public is thinning, and the global system remains unstable enough that walking away carries its own dangers? That is the real test underneath the headlines. For decades, American power was built not only on force, but on the assumption that Washington would absorb burdens others could not. It would keep trade routes open, deter regional aggression, reassure allies, stabilize markets, and act as the ultimate backstop when local balances failed. That model was expensive, often frustrating, and at times self-defeating. But it created a form of order. Not perfect order, not moral purity, but order strong enough to keep major systems from breaking all at once. Now that model is under visible strain. Donald Trump's posture reflects a country that is no longer willing to carry those burdens automatically. His instinct is clear: if the United States has demonstrated strength, why should it remain trapped in the maintenance phase? Why should America continue subsidizing security for partners who depend on U.S. power but do not bear equal risk, equal cost, or equal responsibility? That is not a fringe question anymore. It is becoming a central doctrine of American statecraft. And to be honest, it did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from accumulated exhaustion. From Iraq. From Afghanistan. From interventions that expanded faster than their stated purpose. From years of hearing that global leadership was necessary, while ordinary Americans watched factories close, debts rise, institutions weaken, and trust in elite judgment collapse. Trump did not create that fatigue. He weaponized it. He gave it language. He turned it into a political argument. America can still strike hard, but it no longer has to serve as unpaid manager of every unstable region on Earth. That argument has force because it contains truth. Hegemony is costly. Permanent guardianship drains money, attention, and legitimacy. A nation cannot indefinitely project order abroad if its own citizens no longer believe the bargain makes sense at home. This is where economics and power meet. Strategic commitments are not sustained only by aircraft carriers or intelligence networks. They are sustained by domestic consent. Once that consent weakens, even the strongest empire begins revising its map of obligation. But here is the hard part. Disorder also has a price. When the United States pulls back too fast, it does not enter a neutral world. It enters a world where rivals test limits, allies panic, markets reprice risk, and regional actors begin hedging for a future in which American guarantees are conditional, delayed, or transactional. That does not always produce immediate collapse. Sometimes it produces something more subtle and more dangerous, a slow erosion of confidence in the system itself. And confidence is the hidden currency of power. Once allies start wondering whether Washington will stay, they adjust. Once adversaries sense hesitation, they probe. Once markets detect a gap between American capability and American willingness, they begin assigning a premium to instability. That is how geopolitical retrenchment becomes economic consequence. Not in one dramatic moment, but through repeated recalculations across the entire system. So this crisis reveals an America caught between two truths. One truth is that endless burden sharing without clear return is no longer politically sustainable. The other truth is that global order does not defend itself. That is the tension. That is the cost of this moment. The United States is not only deciding what to do about Iran. It is deciding, in front of the world, whether American power in the coming years will mean stewardship, selective force, or a more openly transactional doctrine where leadership is offered only when the price feels immediately justified. And once that signal is sent, the world will not forget it. The strategic forecast, exit for Washington, unfinished crisis for the region. The most likely outcome from here is not a clean peace. It is a managed exit for Washington layered over an unresolved crisis for the region. That is the strategic forecast Americans need to understand with clear eyes. Donald Trump may be preparing the political language for disengagement. He may soon present the conflict in a way that tells the American public the United States has done what it came to do, demonstrated force, imposed damage, and created the conditions to step back. From a domestic political standpoint, that message makes sense. From a military communication standpoint, it is disciplined. But from a regional and systemic standpoint, it does not answer the hardest question: what structure remains after America reduces its direct role? That is where the danger sits. Because the three main actors are no longer moving toward the same definition of closure. Washington appears to be searching for an exit point. Benjamin Netanyahu appears to be measuring the situation by a harsher standard, one built around deeper suppression of Iran's long-term threat capacity. Tehran, meanwhile, may be damaged but still determined to avoid an ending that looks like surrender. When those three positions collide, the result is rarely peace. More often, it is an unstable pause in which each side claims success publicly while privately preparing for the next round. There are several plausible paths forward, and none of them justify complacency. The first is a controlled American drawdown. In that scenario, the White House narrows U.S. exposure. Financial markets take some comfort from the reduced probability of a prolonged direct American war, and the public hears a message of restored restraint. That may produce short-term relief. But without a durable political framework, relief is not the same as settlement. It is simply lower temperature with unresolved fuel still beneath the floor. The second path is a narrower American role combined with continued Israeli pressure. That would create a different kind of instability. The United States would no longer carry the visible center of the conflict, but Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel would continue acting on the belief that unfinished threat today means larger danger tomorrow. Iran, under that pressure, would likely avoid the symbolism of surrender and instead look for indirect ways to preserve leverage. In that scenario, the war changes shape rather than truly ending. The map cools in one place and heats up in another. The third path is regional spillover without formal escalation. That may sound like a contradiction, but in modern conflict it is common. Shipping insecurity, proxy activation, cyber disruption, infrastructure fear, and energy market volatility can all continue even when leaders claim the central war is winding down. This is one reason why Americans should be careful with the phrase de-escalation. Sometimes de-escalation at the top produces decentralization below. The conflict becomes less visible, but more economically contagious. And then there is the most politically tempting scenario of all, temporary calm followed by delayed relapse. This is the favorite illusion of exhausted governments. Leaders declare that the crisis has been contained. Market steady. Voters move on. Then months later, or a few years later, the same structural conflict returns under a new trigger. This is how unresolved wars survive inside the international system. They disappear from the headline before they disappear from reality. My judgment is simple. Trump may be building an off-ramp for the United States, but an off-ramp for Washington is not the same thing as a settlement for the Middle East. That distinction matters enormously. Great powers often believe that if they can reduce their exposure, they have reduced the danger itself. History says otherwise. Sometimes they have only shifted the timing of the danger, the location of the danger, or the form in which the danger returns. So the real forecast is this: even if America moves toward exit, the underlying crisis architecture may remain active. The military phase may narrow. The political phase may intensify. The economic aftershocks may continue. And the region may remain trapped in a cycle where no actor gets full victory, yet no actor accepts true defeat. That is not peace. That is suspended instability. And for Americans watching from afar, it is a reminder that the most consequential question is never only how a war ends on paper. It is whether anything durable has been built to keep the next one from starting. What this entire story reveals is not just the movement of armies or the language of leaders, but the deeper truth about power in our time. Donald Trump is signaling that the United States may be ready to leave Iran without a deal because, in his view, force has already done enough. Benjamin Netanyahu is signaling something far harsher, that Israel cannot afford a half-finished outcome and must keep pressing until Iran's threat structure is crushed more decisively. Iran, meanwhile, is wounded but not politically broken, which means the conflict may be entering a more dangerous phase of adaptation rather than a clean conclusion. And for ordinary Americans, the consequences do not stop at the battlefield. They move through oil, shipping, inflation, market fear, and the quiet anxiety that global instability can still reach into everyday life. In the end, this is a story about the difference between leaving a crisis and resolving one. It is about the danger of confusing tactical success with strategic peace. It is about how great powers often want clean exits, regional actors want deeper security, and wounded rivals want to prove they still matter. That collision is what makes this moment so unstable. The deeper lesson is one that reaches far beyond politics. In life, just like in global affairs, ending your involvement in a problem is not always the same as solving the problem itself. You can walk away from conflict, pressure, or pain, but if the root structure remains untouched, the crisis often returns in another form. That lesson applies to relationships, work, money, and personal growth. Do not mistake short-term relief for long-term stability. Do not celebrate surface calm if the foundation underneath is still fractured. Real strength is not only about reacting powerfully in the moment. It is also about building something durable enough that the same fire does not come back again and again. Now here is today's quick question for you. Do you believe this crisis is moving toward real de-escalation, or only toward a temporary pause? A. Real de-escalation. B. Temporary pause. Comment A or B below and tell me why. And I want to hear your full view as well. Do you think Donald Trump's strategy shows strength and discipline, or do you think it risks leaving behind a more dangerous unfinished conflict? Share your opinion in the comments so everyone can read, compare, and learn from each other's perspective. And if you value this kind of sharp, serious analysis, subscribe to the channel and support us so we can keep bringing you deeper, stronger content in the videos ahead.